The air was thick with the scent of rain-soaked earth as Jonathan parked his car at the edge of the cemetery. It had been 10 years, a decade filled with guilt, regret, and an unbearable weight of unspoken words. For all that time, he had avoided this place, convincing himself that moving forward meant leaving the past behind. But today was different. Something deep within him urged him to return to his mother's grave. Jonathan had been only 22 when his mother, Eleanor, passed away. She was the cornerstone of his life, his confidant, his guide, and the only parent he had ever known. Her death had been sudden, leaving him unprepared and shattered. But instead of mourning properly, Jonathan threw himself into his work, bearing the pain under layers of busyness and excuses. Now at 32, he found himself unable to ignore the pull of his memories any longer. He exited the car, gripping a bouquet of white lilies, her favorite. The cemetery was eerily quiet, save for the distant rustle of trees swaying in the wind. The gravel crunched beneath his shoes as he made his way through the rows of headstones, each marking a life filled with its own joys and sorrows. As he approached Eleanor's grave, his steps slowed. Her headstone stood there, weathered but dignified, bearing the inscription, Eleanor Grace, a loving mother, forever in our hearts. The sight of her name brought a lump to his throat. He knelt before the grave, placing the lilies gently at its base. "Hi, Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's been a while. Too long, I know." His words faltered as a wave of emotion surged through him. For years, he had carried the guilt of not visiting her, of not being there when she needed him most. He had never forgiven himself for the argument they had just days before her death, a fight over something so trivial he could barely remember the details. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I should have been better. I should have been here sooner." The wind seemed to pick up, carrying his words into the stillness of the cemetery. Jonathan closed his eyes, letting the memories of his mother flood his mind, her laughter, her warmth, and the way she always seemed to know what he needed before he did. Suddenly, he felt a light tap on his shoulder. Startled, he turned around, but there was no one there. The cemetery was empty, save for a stray bird perched on a nearby tree. He frowned, his heart racing. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing in the quiet. There was no response, but an unsettling feeling washed over him, as though he was being watched. Brushing it off as his imagination, he turned back to the grave, unaware that this moment was just the beginning of a life-changing encounter. Jonathan left the cemetery with the mysterious note weighing heavily in his pocket and his thoughts swirling in a chaotic storm. He hadn't felt this unsettled in years, and yet there was a strange comfort in the idea that his mother might still be watching over him in some inexplicable way. The question was, how? Driving back to his childhood home, a small, weathered house on the outskirts of town, Jonathan's mind wandered to the days he had spent there with his mother. Every corner of the house held a memory. The kitchen where she taught him to cook her famous pot roast, the living room where they would curl up with books on rainy days, and the attic where she kept her most treasured belongings. The attic. The thought struck him like a lightning bolt. His mother had always said the attic was a place for memories, letters, photographs, and keepsakes that held pieces of their family history. If there was any clue about the note he had found, it would be there. Jonathan parked the car and walked up to the house, his steps hesitant yet purposeful. The key slid into the lock with a familiar click, and the door creaked open, revealing the home that had remained largely untouched since his mother's passing. A faint, musty smell hung in the air, mingling with the scent of aged wood and memories. He climbed the narrow staircase to the attic, each step creaking under his weight. The door to the attic stuck slightly, as it always had, and he had to give it a firm push to get it open. Sunlight streamed through a small, dusty window, illuminating the piles of boxes and trunks that filled the room. Jonathan took a deep breath and began his search. He opened box after box, sifting through old photographs, handwritten notes, and even a few of his childhood toys. Each item brought a wave of nostalgia, but nothing seemed connected to the mysterious note, until he found a small leather-bound journal tucked beneath a pile of yellowed letters. The journal was his mother's. He recognized it instantly. She used to write in it every night before bed. Flipping through the pages, Jonathan was struck by the intimacy of her thoughts and emotions, preserved in her elegant handwriting. She had written about everything, her hopes, her worries, her love for him. But one entry, dated just a week before her death, stopped him in his tracks. "Jonathan, my dear boy," it began, "I've been thinking a lot about life and the things we leave behind. If something ever happens to me, I want you to know how much you mean to me. You are my greatest joy, and I will always be with you, even if you can't see me. I hope that, in time, you'll find your way back to this journal. There's so much I wish I could tell you, but perhaps some things are better left for you to discover on your own. Remember, love never truly leaves us." Jonathan's hands trembled as he read the words. It was as though his mother had anticipated his visit to the cemetery, his need for closure, even the note he had found. Could she have left these breadcrumbs for him to find, knowing he would need them someday? As he sat there clutching the journal, a thought struck him. The handwriting on the note and the journal were identical. But how could his mother have left that note at her grave 10 years after her passing? The idea seemed impossible, yet the evidence was undeniable. Before he could dwell on the mystery further, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Startled, he pulled it out to see an unknown number calling. Hesitating for a moment, he answered. "Hello? Mr. Jonathan Grace?" a woman's voice asked. "Yes, who is this?" "My name is Margaret. I work at the cemetery. I saw you visiting your mother's grave today. There's something you should know." Jonathan's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" "A man came by this morning and left something at your mother's grave," Margaret said. "I didn't recognize him, but he seemed insistent that it be placed there before you arrived. He said it was important." Jonathan's grip on the phone tightened. "Did he say who he was?" "No, but he left this," Margaret replied. "It's another note. I think you should see it." Jonathan's mind raced as he thanked Margaret and ended the call. Another note? Who was this mysterious man, and why was he leaving messages at his mother's grave? Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Jonathan knew he had to return to the cemetery. This time, he would be ready for whatever, or whoever, was waiting for him. Jonathan didn't waste a moment. After locking up the house and tucking his mother's journal safely into his bag, he drove straight back to the cemetery. The note from Margaret lingered in his mind, filling him with equal parts anticipation and unease. The cemetery was shrouded in the dim glow of twilight when he arrived, the golden hues of the setting sun casting long shadows over the rows of headstones. Margaret, the elderly groundskeeper, was waiting for him near the main gate. Her silver hair glimmered in the fading light, and her kind but weathered face betrayed a hint of concern. As Jonathan approached, she held out a small envelope. "This is it," she said softly. "He told me to make sure you got this." Jonathan accepted the envelope, his fingers brushing the rough edges of the paper. "Did he say anything else?" he asked, his voice tense. Margaret shook her head. "Not much, except that he's been watching over you. He mentioned your mother's name as though he knew her well, but I've never seen him before. Tall man, dark coat, had an air of importance about him. Almost felt like he didn't belong here." Jonathan thanked her, though her words only deepened the mystery. He stepped away and opened the envelope, revealing another handwritten note. The text was brief but chilling. "Jonathan, it's time you know the truth. Look for the tree where she always sat." He read the message twice, his heart pounding. The tree where she always sat. His mind raced back to his childhood. His mother had a favorite spot in the cemetery, a large oak tree at the far end of the grounds. She would sit there for hours, lost in thought or quietly reading. It was her sanctuary, a place where she felt closest to her late parents. Fueled by a strange mix of fear and determination, Jonathan made his way to the oak tree. The cemetery felt different now, almost alive, as though the very air was charged with anticipation. As he neared the tree, he noticed something unusual, a small box resting against its massive trunk. Kneeling down, he picked up the box. It was old, made of polished wood, with delicate carvings of flowers along its edges. His name was engraved on the lid, written in the same handwriting as the notes. With trembling hands, he opened it. Inside was a collection of items that took his breath away. A locket containing a picture of him as a child, a small diary, and a folded piece of paper. The locket had belonged to his mother, He remembered her wearing it every day until the end. He held it close, the cool metal pressing against his palm. Unfolding the piece of paper, he found another message. Jonathan, I've left behind pieces of myself for you to find, but I couldn't tell you everything before I left. There were secrets I had to keep to protect you. This diary holds the answers. Read it, and you'll understand. Love always, Mom. Jonathan's hands shook as he picked up the diary. Its cover was soft and worn, as though it had been held countless times. Flipping through the pages, he realized it contained entries from the last months of his mother's life. The first few entries were filled with her typical musings, her love for him, her worries about his future, and her reflections on the life they had shared. But as he read further, the tone shifted. The entries became cryptic, filled with references to a shadow and promises she had made. One particular entry stopped him cold. If anything happens to me, know that I did it for you. There are people who would harm us, Jonathan. I've done everything I can to keep you safe, but the cost has been great. Trust the man who leaves you these notes. He's the only one who can help you now. Jonathan's mind raced as he tried to piece together the puzzle. What kind of danger had his mother been protecting him from? And who was the mysterious man leaving these notes? As he sat there lost in thought, he heard the crunch of footsteps behind him. Turning quickly, he saw a figure standing just beyond the tree line. It was a man dressed in a long, dark coat, his face obscured by the shadows of dusk. "Who are you?" Jonathan called out, his voice firm despite the fear gripping his chest. The man stepped closer, his features becoming visible in the faint light. He was tall and imposing, with piercing eyes that seemed to see right through Jonathan. "I've been waiting for you," the man said, his voice deep and steady. "Your mother trusted me to guide you when the time was right. That time is now." Jonathan stood, clutching the diary tightly. "What do you mean? What's going on?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured toward the box. "Everything you need to know is in there. But there's more to this story than you realize. Your mother's death wasn't what it seemed." Jonathan felt the ground shift beneath him. "What are you talking about? She died of a heart attack." The man shook his head. "No, Jonathan. She was silenced. For protecting you." Jonathan stood frozen, his breath caught in his throat. The stranger's words echoed in his mind. Your mother was silenced. He wanted to deny it, to hold on to the narrative he'd believed for years, that her death was a tragic but natural end to her life. But deep down, he felt the cracks forming in that belief. "Who are you?" Jonathan demanded, his voice tinged with anger and desperation. "And how do you know all this about my mother?" The man stepped closer, his expression calm but intense. "My name is Daniel. I worked with your mother closely. We were both part of something much bigger than you realize, something dangerous. She sacrificed herself to protect you, Jonathan, because you're more important than you know." Jonathan's grip on the diary tightened. "Why should I believe you? You show up out of nowhere, leave cryptic notes at her grave, and now you're telling me my entire life is a lie?" Daniel's gaze softened. "I understand how hard this is to hear, but your mother trusted me, and I made a promise to her, a promise to protect you and to tell you the truth when the time was right. If you want answers, they're in that diary. And if you want proof, follow me." Jonathan hesitated, torn between his instinct to flee and his burning need for answers. Against his better judgment, he nodded. "Fine. Show me." Daniel led him through the cemetery, his long coat billowing slightly in the cool evening breeze. They reached a black car parked just outside the gates. Daniel opened the trunk, revealing a steel case. Inside were files, photographs, and a small device that looked like a thumb drive. "These," Daniel said, gesturing to the files, "are your mother's records." She was part of an organization dedicated to exposing corruption at the highest levels. But they made powerful enemies. When they found out about her work, they came after her. She knew the risks and did everything she could to protect you from them. Jonathan sifted through the files, his hands trembling. Photographs of his mother at meetings, pages of handwritten notes, and newspaper clippings of scandals she had uncovered filled the case. It was overwhelming, but one photograph caught his attention. In the image, his mother stood beside Daniel and a group of other people, all wearing serious expressions. But what struck him most was the look in her eyes, a mix of determination and fear. She looks terrified, Jonathan murmured. She was, Daniel admitted, but she was also brave. She believed in what she was doing, even when the threat started. And when she realized they might come after you to get to her, she made the ultimate sacrifice. Jonathan's chest tightened. What do you mean? What kind of sacrifice? Daniel hesitated, his jaw clenching as if he were holding back painful memories. She made a deal. They wanted her research, her evidence. She agreed to stop her investigation and destroy everything she had if they left you alone. But they killed her anyway, Jonathan said, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel nodded. They wanted to make sure she couldn't change her mind or start over. And they wanted to send a message to anyone else who might try to expose them. The weight of the revelation threatened to crush Jonathan. All this time, he had thought his mother's death was an unavoidable tragedy. Now he realized it was a deliberate act, a calculated move by people who saw her as a threat. Why are you telling me this now? Jonathan asked, his voice trembling. Why not tell me years ago? Because it wasn't safe, Daniel replied. They've been watching you, waiting to see if you'd follow in her footsteps. I've spent years keeping them off your trail, but now they're distracted. It's the first time we've had a chance to act without putting you in immediate danger. Jonathan's mind raced as he tried to process everything. His mother's bravery, the organization she had fought against, the sacrifices she had made. It was all too much. But one thought rose above the chaos. He needed to finish what she had started. What do we do now? He asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. Daniel smiled faintly. That's the question your mother always asked. And the answer is the same. We fight. But first you need to understand everything. That diary holds the key to her story, and yours. Take it home, read it carefully, and then decide if you're ready for what comes next. Jonathan nodded, clutching the diary as though it were a lifeline. He didn't know if he was ready, but he knew he had to try. His mother had given everything to protect him, and now it was his turn to honor her legacy. As he drove home, the weight of the diary in his lap felt heavier than ever. It wasn't just a collection of memories. It was a map to the truth, a guide to the battle that lay ahead. And for the first time in years, Jonathan felt a spark of purpose. Jonathan sat at his kitchen table late into the night, the only light coming from a small lamp. The diary lay open before him, its pages filled with his mother's careful handwriting. Each word pulled him deeper into a story he could barely believe. Her entries were a mix of love and heartbreak, documenting her fears for his safety and the monumental weight of the secrets she carried. But as the pages turned, the entries grew darker. She began writing about anonymous threats, mysterious men watching her from a distance, and cryptic warnings from an insider who seemed to know too much. One entry, dated just weeks before her death, stood out. They are closer than ever, and I can feel their eyes on me. Every step I take, every person I meet, it's as if they know. Daniel says he can help protect Jonathan, but I'm not sure even he can stop them. I'm leaving this journal for Jonathan in case something happens. My darling son, if you're reading this, know that my only regret is not being able to see you grow into the man I know you'll become. Jonathan's chest tightened. The realization that his mother had been living under such constant fear made him feel both furious and helpless. She had carried this burden alone, all to shield him from a danger he hadn't even known existed. The more he read, the clearer the picture became. His mother had been investigating a powerful corporate syndicate involved in illegal activities, money laundering, trafficking, and even political manipulation. Her evidence could have brought their entire operation crashing down, but they had silenced her before she could expose them. One passage near the end of the diary made him freeze. There's a man who visits the cemetery. He's part of them, but he's different. He doesn't want to hurt us. I think he feels guilty. He left me a note once, warning me to stop. Maybe he's the key to keeping Jonathan safe. Jonathan's heart raced as he read and reread those lines. Was this the same man who had been leaving notes at her grave now? If so, why hadn't he come forward sooner? As dawn broke, Jonathan closed the diary and leaned back in his chair. Exhaustion tugged at him, but his mind refused to rest. He needed answers, more than what the diary could provide. Suddenly, his phone buzzed on the table, pulling him from his thoughts. The screen displayed an unknown number. "Hello?" he answered hesitantly. "Jonathan," a familiar voice said. It was Daniel. "We need to talk. Now." Jonathan's stomach sank. "What's going on?" "They know you've been reading the diary," Daniel said, his voice urgent. "They're coming for you." Jonathan's blood ran cold. "What do you mean? How could they know?" "Because they've been watching, just like I told you. They've been waiting for you to make a move, and now they know you're on to them. Pack a bag and meet me at the old warehouse on 5th Street. I'll explain everything there." The call ended abruptly, leaving Jonathan gripping the phone, his heart pounding in his chest. Fear and adrenaline coursed through him as he scrambled to gather a few essentials. As he prepared to leave, a faint sound outside his window made him pause. Peeking through the curtain, he saw a black car idling at the curb. Two men in suits were stepping out, their eyes scanning the house. Jonathan's pulse quickened. He grabbed the diary and slipped out through the back door, sticking to the shadows as he made his way to his car. He didn't know who these men were, but he was certain they weren't here to talk. The drive to the warehouse was a blur, his mind racing with possibilities. By the time he arrived, the sky was streaked with the pinks and oranges of early morning. Daniel was waiting for him, standing in the shadows near the entrance. "We don't have much time," Daniel said as Jonathan approached. "They're already moving against us. But I have a plan." Jonathan didn't hesitate. "Tell me what to do." Daniel's expression was grim. "This won't be easy, but if we pull it off, we can take them down and finally get justice for your mother." As the two men slipped into the warehouse, Jonathan knew there was no turning back. The fight his mother had started was now his to finish, and he was ready to face whatever came next. The dim light of the warehouse cast long shadows across the room as Daniel spread a map across a rusted metal table. Red markings and arrows crisscrossed the surface, showing locations, routes, and names that meant little to Jonathan, but clearly formed a critical plan. "They've been operating from a central hub," Daniel began, his voice steady but urgent. "If we can expose it, the entire syndicate will collapse. But we need to act now. They know you've inherited the diary, and they won't stop until they've silenced you too." Jonathan felt the weight of his mother's diary in his jacket pocket. It was both a shield and a target, the evidence she had died to protect. "What do we need to do?" he asked, his voice firm. Daniel pointed to a red circle on the map. "This is their headquarters, a seemingly innocuous corporate office, but it's where they store encrypted files detailing all their illegal operations. We need to get in, copy those files, and release them to the public." Jonathan stared at the map, his mind racing. "And how do we do that without getting caught?" "That's the hard part," Daniel admitted. "They have layers of security. But I've been planning for this moment for years. I have access codes, and I know their weak points. All I need is someone willing to take the risk. Someone they don't expect." Jonathan nodded, understanding immediately. "You mean me?" "You're the only one who can do this," Daniel said. "They know me, but you're still a ghost to them, someone they haven't fully tracked. If we move fast, we can use that to our advantage." As they finalized the plan, Jonathan couldn't ignore the pounding of his heart. Fear clawed at him, but so did a fierce determination. His mother had given everything for this fight, and now it was his turn to see it through. That night, Jonathan stood outside the towering office building. Its glass facade gleamed under the streetlights, a polished mask hiding the corruption within. Daniel's voice crackled in his earpiece. "Stay calm. Remember the plan. You've got this." Jonathan took a deep breath and walked through the front entrance, his posture confident despite the storm raging inside him. He swiped the access card Daniel had given him and stepped into the elevator, punching in the code for the 15th floor. The elevator ride felt like an eternity, the quiet hum of the machinery amplifying his anxiety. When the doors finally opened, he found himself in a sterile hallway lined with doors. At the end of the corridor was the server room, the heart of the operation. Jonathan moved quickly but cautiously, his footsteps muffled by the carpeted floor. He reached the server room door, swiped the card again, and held his breath as the lock clicked open. Inside, rows of blinking servers stretched before him, He plugged the device Daniel had given him into a terminal and watched as files began transferring. The progress bar inched forward agonizingly slowly. Suddenly, a faint noise behind him made him freeze. He turned to see a security guard standing in the doorway, his hand moving toward his radio. Thinking fast, Jonathan grabbed a nearby fire extinguisher and slammed it against the wall, triggering the alarm. The shrill sound filled the air, and the guard hesitated, caught between calling for backup and responding to the alarm. Jonathan took the chance to slip past him, the flash drive clutched tightly in his hand. He sprinted down the hallway, the sound of shouting and footsteps growing louder behind him. Outside, Daniel was waiting in a nondescript van. He yanked open the door as Jonathan ran toward him. "Did you get it?" Daniel asked as Jonathan dove into the passenger seat. Jonathan held up the flash drive, his chest heaving. "I got it." Daniel didn't waste a second, slamming his foot on the gas and speeding away. The next few days were a blur. Daniel worked tirelessly to decrypt the files and compile the evidence into a damning report. When the information was finally released, it sparked a media firestorm. Headlines screamed about the corruption, and authorities launched immediate investigations. Jonathan watched the news coverage from his small apartment, a mix of relief and sadness washing over him. Justice was finally being served, but it had come at a great cost. Later that evening, he returned to the cemetery, the diary in hand. Standing before his mother's grave, he knelt and placed the book on the ground. "We did it, Mom," he whispered. "We finished what you started." A gentle breeze rustled the leaves around him, and for the first time in years, Jonathan felt at peace. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: his mother's sacrifice had not been in vain.